now in Israel, they're talking about potentially giving a safe passage to members of the armed Palestinian resistance to move freely between one place to another. However, there's something behind this report in Israel. Everything you read in the Israeli media, or generally, of course, in mainstream media, you need to try and read between the lines. Israel allowed already the Palestinian resistance to operate in areas that it considers to be under its control. Now, the talk about allowing the Palestinian resistance safe passage or freedom of movement from one place to another could indicate something much more different than what we're hearing about phase two, which is in effect allowing the Palestinian resistance to move freely all across of Gaza with the presence of the International Stabilization Force. How can Israel do that, you may ask? Well, Israel has done that before. Not once, not twice, and not three times, but more than that. As a matter of fact, leaders in the Palestinian resistance were moving wherever they wanted to, and no one would target them because they went into an agreement, and that's that. Israel can't do anything about it. As a matter of fact, there were training camps of the Palestinian resistance anyway that Israel used to monitor and see. But of course, went totally blind on October the 7th. Completely blind, as in nothing worked for Israel. Not to say that there was no planning from the resistance or there was an operation, or there was. But Israel, where everything all of a sudden not working, no surveillance, no nothing, no. That's what happened. So, from an Israeli perspective, although Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to, show authority, he went actually and visited the HQ where the United States Forces CENTCOM is based now, literally running the country. And as a matter of fact, there were protests in Israel in the past several days in Kiryat Gat in what they called a breach of Israel's sovereignty. What's happening there? American troops moving all around. Some people started to say, we don't feel like we live in Israel anymore. We have other armies here in the country. What's happening exactly? Now, Benjamin Netanyahu went there to show some authority. And then he stated that, we're in full agreement with the US forces and this HQ to disarm Hamas in the day after, because he started to get embarrassed time after time. And many people started to say that he's losing sovereignty, and the United States is now owning Israel as a puppet state or as a proxy state. Israeli media is mocking Benjamin Netanyahu too. But he's trying to show that, no, everything is under control. It's not the Americans running the country. I am running the country. And he wants to reassure the Israeli people that anything moving on from now in relation to the ceasefire, whether it's phase one or phase two, is not going to be against the will of the Israeli state, and it's going to be completely coordinated with Israel. Nothing is going to happen that we don't like. Nothing is going to happen that we go against. However, the developments on the ground do show something slightly different. As a matter of fact, now there's going to be an important meeting in Turkey with some of the Arab and Muslim countries, American delegations reportedly too, and the Turkish authorities. Talking about what? Talking about phase two. They wanted to talk about phase two and what's going to happen after that, trying to curb Netanyahu's powers yet again. In several cases, we saw the pressure that was being applied from the Arab and Muslim states on or towards the American administration led by Trump being effective in Gaza. And one thing that Israel is facing that's a challenge for it now is the fact that Donald Trump, the American president, has directly put himself as the guarantor of the ceasefire agreement. And he reportedly told Israel if they're going to sabotage the agreement, then they're going to lose the United States, according to several reports. Of course, how substantiated that is, so it's a separate story. You know the score. But Now they're trying to push things forward. Why? Because they want to rush into phase two. That's it. Phase one is almost out of the way. Israel got the bodies of its terrorists that it killed in Gaza back, almost all of them, although they're obstructing, by the way, the Palestinian resistance. And we need to go into phase two. Now, in relation to that phase, again, a very sensitive phase, because it would require Israel withdrawing from the remaining parts that it's still present in and occupying inside of Gaza. And it would allow the beginning of more aid, more reconstruction in Gaza, more medical aid, more heavy equipment going in, more freedom of movement to the population, people going back to these areas where the Israeli terror forces were present in the entry of the International Stabilization Force. And that's it. When you have the International Stabilization Force, we're talking about a transitional period. This is where things get tricky. There were several comments being made in the past couple of days, one of them by Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdurrahman Al Thani. The international force, he said, needs a clear mandate and must communicate with a Palestinian entity in Gaza. Now, that is a very important position coming from the mediators. Why? Because the ISF in the Israeli version is far different to the ISF from a Palestinian version. From an Israeli version, they want a force that will be working on behalf of Israel, a front for the IDF, solely focused on disarming the Palestinian resistance and nothing more than that. And they don't want to give it a time limit, and they don't necessarily want an international mandate, and they want it to be bound by Israeli and American forces who give it orders that they implement inside of the Gaza Strip. That's not what the Palestinian side wants. That's something that is completely against what the Palestinian side wants and is demanding. As a matter of fact, what the mediators are asking for and demanding too, with a level of understanding from the American administration. How? Well, number one, the mediators are calling for a mandate. And what we mean by a mandate now is something that is being authorized and pushed for by the United Nations. So the Security Council would need to come up with a resolution. They need to have this international backing, international protection. And also, they need very specific tasks. Tell us what we're going to do. The fact that there was a lot of ambiguity surrounding the case of the International Stabilization Forces and lack of clarity and transparency for their role and what they're going to do led several countries who actually volunteered to take a step back and be more cautious and suspicious of the move. They started to say, we need to know what we're going to do. Up until when the Palestinian side said that they need a time limit. We need to know what they're going to do here. And here that's resonating with the Qatari Prime Minister, who also said that they need to report and communicate with the Palestinian entity in Gaza. What do we understand? What's the first thing that we understand here? Number one, that there is some sort of a suggestion that they won't be communicating with the Palestinian entity, but with the new mandate, with maybe Tony Blair or Donald Trump directly, without any speaking with anyone in Gaza. And a neo-colonialism, like a new colonialism in the area on behalf of the Zionist entity. That is clearly not what the mediators want, and of course not what the Palestinians want, let alone the Palestinian resistance that was very clear on that side. They said that we're not going to allow anyone to go and work on behalf of Israel. As a matter of fact, if any force comes in against our will or with efforts to do harm to the Palestinian people, they're going to be treated as an occupying force. No country wants to put itself in the position of an occupying force in Gaza. Even at the peak of the genocide, and supposedly with the most supportive country or administration of Israel in the form of the United States didn't go and fight on behalf of Israel. That's the truth. Yes, they supported. Yes, they funded. Yes, they logistically supported, and with intelligence too, likewise with Britain as well and other countries. No one went to fight and die for Israel on behalf of Israelis. No one did that. As a matter of fact, no one else is interested in doing that. Don't you think Israel tried? Israel tried. But Israel even failed to keep the American aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean in the beginning of the genocide. Let's not forget that. 2 months in, it went there to supposedly deter Hezbollah and Iran from attacking Israel, left before even things escalated. Israel lobbied heavily, but the United States refused. Again, to show that there are certain differences here, not the fact that the United States administration isn't complicit or a full participant in this genocide. No, without the United States administration, there wouldn't have been a genocide because they provided Israel with whatever they want. Now, however, that we're going into phase 2, things are starting to get more clear by the day. And there's a reason why they are trying to accelerate all of the talks in relation to this. Well, phase 1 is technically supposed to end with the final Israeli prisoner of war who was buried in Gaza being handed to Israel. That's probably going to take several more weeks. When that is over, that's it. You're going to have to go into phase 2. Now, with the nature of the ceasefire agreement, there were no specific timelines, or at least no public timelines on when phase 1 will end. But the mediators and also the American side are understanding very well that that's it. When the last Israeli prisoner of war or their bodies in Gaza go back to Israel, we're going to have to go into phase 2, and that's it. We need to have the ISF, and the ISF and their role in Gaza needs to be very clearly defined and with an international mandate. Now, Netanyahu would try and sabotage this as much as possible. And as a matter of fact, he already did. He did with the constant Israeli breaches, the provocations, the banning of the sufficient numbers of aid, although a lot of aid is going in, but that's not what's required, preventing additional medical aid, obstructing the additional entry of heavy equipment from going into Gaza. And also the people are still suffering from basic things in Gaza, like not accessing water and going to fill up their water tanks every day, hoping that they're going to get a next meal from somewhere. Very tough conditions. Then, of course, by the huge breaches where Israel would start carrying out intense strikes in multiple parts in Gaza, sometimes even just after the Palestinian resistance would hand some of the bodies back. But if you noticed, although Israel had these breaches and although the Palestinian side showed a lot of restraint to make this work, to proceed with the ceasefire agreement, Israel ceased these intense escalatory attacks, which indicates that what? That there are certain limitations in terms of maneuverability. Not altogether, not totally, not completely, but there are limitations. Otherwise, Netanyahu would have been going all out and continuously bombing everyone and everything in Gaza, and we would have at least a 3-figure number a day of people being killed inside of the Gaza Strip. But these days, these coming days, are going to be some of the most important days because the majority of the intensity is happening behind closed doors, and that's in the negotiating rooms between all of the delegations. Several delegations are moving from one capital to another to try and finalize the role of the ISF in Gaza, and also trying to get over with this phase 1 as soon as possible, so that when it's about time to enter into phase 2, everything is clear and there are no additional problematic issues coming from the Israeli side to try and obstruct it on the path to a longer-term solution inside of Gaza.